Most people will never know what you actually noticed, and that gap between what you picked up and what was visible to anyone else is one of the more quietly isolating experiences in social life. If you've ever walked into a room and immediately sensed that something was slightly off, that someone's tone had shifted, or that the energy between two people felt different from the last time you saw them, there's a good chance you're the kind of person whose mind is always quietly running a background scan on the people around you. And here's the part that rarely gets said. The accuracy of that scan is both a gift and a burden. Because being right about people consistently before they've said a word, that's not a small thing to carry. Psychology has a compelling explanation for why some people are wired this way. Because people who notice subtle changes in others aren't just being observant. They're processing social information at a depth that most people around them don't even realize is possible. And the world they're navigating as a result looks genuinely different from the one everyone else thinks they share. The pattern is worth understanding, because it shapes how these people move through the world in ways that are both genuinely remarkable and quietly exhausting. There's a specific kind of moment people in this category know very well. You're in a conversation, and everything on the surface seems completely normal. The words are fine, the person is smiling. But something in the way they answered, a half-second delay, a sentence that ended slightly differently than it usually would, a warmth that was present last time and is just barely absent now, has registered somewhere in you. You can't always name it precisely, but you felt it. And you're probably familiar with what comes next. You file it. You don't say anything, because what would you even say? I noticed something in the way you paused, but you hold onto it. You turn it over later. You check in on the person a few days later, casually, the way people do who don't want to make a thing of it, and sometimes they tell you weeks later that something really was wrong, that they'd been carrying something and hadn't known how to bring it up. There's also the experience of walking into a room where two people have just finished a conversation, and knowing, without a word being said, without anything obvious having changed, that something happened. The air feels different. The way they're positioned relative to each other is slightly off. And everyone else in the room seems to notice nothing at all. That's not luck. That's a perceptual system working at a level of resolution that most people's doesn't reach. Psychologists who study how people read social signals have noticed something worth understanding. Human beings vary significantly in how much information they actually extract from a social interaction. Most people pick up the broad strokes. They register what someone said, the general emotional tone, whether the interaction felt positive or negative, and that's enough for most purposes. But some people extract much more. They process micro-expressions, like the tiny, involuntary flickers of emotion that cross a face in a fraction of a second before the social mask settles back into place. They track vocal patterns. They notice when a person's cadence has changed, or when their usual verbal tics are missing, or when they're holding their body differently than they normally do. They're running a vastly more detailed model of the person in front of them. This isn't a choice, exactly. It's not that these people decided to pay closer attention. It's that their nervous system collects more data by default. The details come in whether they're invited or not. This shows up not just in big moments, but in the smallest interactions. It's noticing that a friend texted back slightly more briefly than usual, and wondering if something's wrong, even though, logically, people have short text days for completely ordinary reasons. It's sensing that a colleague is quieter than normal in a meeting and spending part of your attention tracking them rather than the agenda. It's being in a conversation with someone and knowing, before they've said anything to suggest it, that they're about to change the subject, because something in the way they shifted their weight or broke eye contact told you. It's also possible you've had the experience of mentioning one of these observations to someone else and being met with a look of genuine confusion. They seemed completely fine to me. And you stood there with this very clear internal signal that something was different, and no external evidence that would satisfy anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. That gap between what you noticed and what was visible to others is one of the more isolating aspects of perceiving this way. Not painful, exactly, just quietly solitary. The psychological roots of why some people develop this level of social attunement trace back to something that happens early in life. Researchers who study how people develop emotional intelligence have found that heightened sensitivity to the states of others often develops in environments where reading people accurately was important. Not necessarily dramatic environments. Sometimes it was simply having a parent whose moods shifted in ways that weren't always announced, or growing up in a household where the emotional climate changed and nobody talked about it directly, or being a child who needed to understand the adults around them to feel secure, and who learned through thousands of small observations how to do that. The nervous system is adaptable in early childhood in a way it simply isn't later. And if what the environment required was a finely tuned antenna for other people's states, that's what got built, not as damage, as calibration. The mind shaped itself around what it needed to know to navigate the world it was actually in. And the remarkable thing is that this calibration doesn't go away. It doesn't get put down when the original environment changes. It becomes part of how you move through the world permanently. The antenna stays on. There's a quality to the inner life of people who notice subtle changes in others that's worth naming. Because it isn't just that they observe things, it's that they feel a pull to do something with what they observe. When you notice that someone isn't quite themselves, it's rarely neutral information for a person wired this way. There's usually something that follows, an impulse to check in, to gently create an opening, to let the person know without saying so directly that they've been seen. Most of the time, this impulse is managed carefully. You learn not to say, "I can tell something's wrong," directly to people who haven't signaled they want to talk about it. You learn to ask about their week in a way that leaves a door open rather than pressing them to walk through it. This is a form of care that operates almost below the level of language. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the right question asked at the right time, or the text sent on an ordinary Tuesday that somehow arrived on exactly the day someone needed it. The people on the receiving end of this kind of attention often describe it as feeling genuinely known, not performed care, not social obligation, something more like being held in focus by someone who's paying real attention. But there's a shadow side, and it deserves honest acknowledgement. When your perceptual system is collecting this much social data constantly, it is working all the time. There's no off switch in a room full of people. Every interaction is simultaneously the interaction itself and a layer of data running underneath it, tracking, comparing, flagging, updating your model of each person against the last version you held. That's a significant cognitive load, and over time, it can produce a particular kind of fatigue that's hard to explain to people who don't experience it. It's not the fatigue of doing too much. It's the fatigue of noticing too much, of carrying not just your own emotional weight in a room, but a detailed read of everyone else's, of being the person who sensed the tension before it surfaced, who registered the shift before it was named, who carried the awareness of a dynamic that nobody else was tracking yet. Some people who experience this find themselves withdrawing from social environments, not because they don't want connection, but because full presence in a room full of people is genuinely depleting in a way that's hard to recover from quickly. The solitude after isn't emptiness. It's the nervous system coming down from a level of input that most people around them never reached. There's also a more internal cost worth naming carefully. People whose default mode is to track others at this level sometimes find that the same attunement that makes them so perceptive about other people's states makes them less certain about their own. When you've spent years with your attention oriented outward, reading, tracking, sensing, adjusting, the inward signal can get quieter by comparison. The practice of noticing what others need becomes so habitual that noticing what you need can require deliberate effort. Some people watching this may recognize something in that. The strange experience of being the person everyone comes to when they need to be understood and still feeling in some private way that you're less certain about your own inner landscape than you are about everyone else's. What's worth sitting with, though, is what this capacity actually offers the people around someone wired this way. Most of us move through the world with the quiet hope that someone will notice when we're not quite okay. That someone will catch the thing we couldn't quite say. That the people who love us are paying close enough attention to see us, not just the composed version, but the version underneath it, the one we're carrying privately. People who notice subtle changes in others are the ones who actually do that, reliably, without being asked, without making a performance of it. They catch people, they hold them in focus, they create the experience of being genuinely seen in a world that mostly runs on the surface. That's not a minor thing. In many people's lives, there is one person, maybe two, who does this for them. And that person is almost always someone exactly like this. So when you find yourself sensing that something has shifted in someone before they've said a word, when you notice the absence of something as clearly as most people notice the presence of things, it might not mean you're oversensitive or reading too much into ordinary moments. It might simply mean your mind is wired for depth of connection, for the kind of attention that makes people feel genuinely held. For noticing what most people walk past. The thing you do quietly, often without recognition, is one of the rarest forms of care there is. So now I'm curious, are you someone who tends to notice those subtle shifts in others? Who picks up on things before anyone has said anything? Or are you more the opposite? Someone who takes people at face value and needs things to be spelled out a little more clearly before you register them? Drop it in the comments. And if you recognize someone you know in this video rather than yourself, I'd love to know that too.